When you first hear rock and roll, you might think of hard rock bands like Guns N' Roses or maybe AC/DC from the 80s. But we will be diving off stage and into the crowd back when rock and roll had a very controversial start in the 1950s when it was a lesser known genre. You're listening to WJHS 91.5, The Eagle. Welcome to Media in the Making, a podcast where we look at the evolution of media from the 1600s all the way to present day 2022. In this podcast series, we ask, how have different forms of media evolved and changed culture? Media in the Making, where media and culture are always changing. Now let's take a step back in time.
During the 1950s, rock and roll was brought to fame by African American culture. This genre had been taken in by people such as Elvis Presley. He came to fame by playing on a radio channel every weekday, bringing this new type of rock and roll with him. But before Elvis was a popular artist, rock and roll was known to be, in the eyes of most people, a bad influence on the youth culture. They believed that rock and roll was too harsh for an upcoming genre. Rock and roll was also considered a genre that was never accepted for most people's eyes in World War II.
Throughout the years, the idea of rock and roll had been started as a genre that was hated by culture and later gained popularity due to many famous artists that started their careers in the 1950s. Lots of great examples like Elvis Presley, the Dominoes, and Chuck Berry started in the 1950s. This eventually started to increase the culture of rock and roll all the way to the 1960s. Rock and roll had inspired so many people, and culture increased dramatically with rock and roll. Rock and roll also helped some acts in the U.S. A good example is the idea of the Civil Rights Act that was later signed in 1964. A year later, the Voting Rights Act was signed in 1965. Throughout history, the media has had influence from rock and roll, with learning on how to have freedom and originality with music, or, for example, it changed how people listened to music, or even to what they watched on TV, the style of clothes, and even dancing.
Later, as technology was evolving, rock and roll was expanding with the idea of having portable tapes that can be listened to on the go. Also, the creation of censorship was introduced for the young media so that they can listen to any of the music without learning about any violence or any violent acts, but still listen to their favorite artists. Overall, rock and roll has shown to be a genre that has started very disrespected, later to one of the most admired genres with the influencing idea of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. These are just two major examples that rock and roll had, as rock and roll had more popularity when artists were starting to come over to the U.S., like the Beatles, moving from Britain to the United States for the fame gaining more interest in the genre.
Eventually being accepted by culture, rock and roll helped many people like Elvis, Chuck Berry, and the Dominoes become famous. Elvis specifically signed with a record label called RCA based out of Nashville, Tennessee. Elvis's career started taking off from there, and he became known as the King of Rock and Roll. He was one of the first people to make rock and roll what it is today, back in the 50s. Another one of these people was Chuck Berry. He released his first hit in 1955, and it was called Maybelline. This song reached top 5 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B charts. Although his most influential song that everybody knows to take the charts was, of course, Johnny Be Good. This was a song that changed rock and roll for the rest of history. Both of these two singers had a major effect on rock and roll and what it is today. For that, we thank both of them for bringing rock and roll to life back in the 50s.
Media in the Making is brought to you by WJHS 91.5 and the Eagle Tech Academy Mass Media classes. Media in the Making teaches you about the evolution of media throughout history and its effect on culture. For more from the students, this podcast series is on 91.5 website, WJHS915.org. Thank you for joining us.